Dr. Kelly Watson here, and I'm going to talk now about the Facilitator Guide, the art of the Facilitator Guide. So the goal of the Facilitator Guide is to ensure that whoever's facilitating your class learning session stays on track and continues to ensure that the learning objectives of the course are met. And having a facilitator guide can bring you back from all kinds of distractions that can happen inside of a class. Learners struggle with an activity or a conversation goes off track because the learners, start to, maybe derail the conversation or bring the course off track. And so having a facilitator guide just gives you this great scaffold to be able to stay on track, make sure that you're meeting the learning objectives, and overall know what you're doing, because oftentimes I do design, but I'm not the person necessarily who's going to deliver the class session. So it's important that my facilitators, as much as possible, are sticking to what I have designed and not, sort of running amok. But it's also very valuable for me as well to have a document that keeps me on track for my own, when I'm giving my own classes, and also as a point of reflection, because often I give the same classes year over year. And so it gives me an opportunity to run a class the way it was designed, and then make notes at the end about what worked, where was the timing off, if I ran out of time, why, and then I can debrief and figure out what I can modify in the future to make the learning even more effective, or make the class more successful in general. So let me start by just giving you an example of what a facilitator guide for one of my undergraduate classes looks like. Now, understand that I have intended to teach this class myself, so these notes are for me and for no one else. I did not design these for someone else to be able to deliver my class, although they have had that desired effect if or that secondary effect if I am sick, or if somebody else, I'm going to bring in a guest lecturer or something, I can show them this so they know where to fit their content into the content that I have. So because of that, I don't have the learning objectives, and I don't have some of these other things written down that I would if I was going to design for somebody else. But there are some components of this that are helpful, I think. So this class was a class on Teams, and it runs from 6 to 9:20 at night. And so that's important to be able to scaffold my activities and keep myself on track. I also have to do certain things to prepare for the class, like make sure that the storming, forming, norming article is in Brightspace, and that we're going to reference that, that I have my PowerPoint, that I'm using a PowerPoint in this particular class, and a little reminder to take attendance, although I generally don't forget to do that. And then I have the activities. So here I'm specifically walking through a textbook, and I just have a couple of, notes here to remind myself of what the textbook says. Because, I know what forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning mean, but I want to make sure that as much as possible, I'm reflecting consistency with the textbook, because the textbook is what, is required for these learners, and it's what they will have read. So I've put in some little notes to myself about that. This first section is just a walkthrough to just remind them they should have read it. Most of them won't have, so we do a little walkthrough. And then because this is also a rubric item that the school requires, or the department requires that they learn, I have a couple of asterisks here that we have to spend some significant time here, because this is something that the department requires they learn. So I've got just my notes about that. But then see here, I have this activity. So this activity is expected to take an hour, and it's called my team building puzzle competition. I have the notes for how to do it, which I've also put into the PowerPoint so that the students know how to do the activity. Really important, because every time you explain something to students, the first hand goes up and says, I don't get it, or what are we doing? As soon as you break kids do a breakout group, they're so focused on each other and whatnot that they don't remember what they're doing. So I also put it up on a slide, but I give myself a little note here as to how to do it. This is not that detailed, because I've run this activity a million times, and so I don't need that much instruction. But if I was going to have somebody else do it, this would be a lot more detailed. It also tells me what I have to have prepared and bring to class. I pull that out to the side just so that I can, when I show up for school that day, make sure that I have all the materials I need. And then I have the debrief questions, really, really important. They also depend, there's a lot of debrief questions here. They depend on how the activity went and whether or not my learning objective did show up. It usually does. Again, I've run this activity a million times, so I know that my activity is going to achieve that. But if I was running it for the first time, I might have a smattering of these, and I might just pull out what learning objectives actually did get achieved. This lecture happens to have a little bit about task interdependence, so that's why I wanted to make sure that that was pulled out. Then we have another activity where we're going to work in teams. We're going to do this case analysis, some more instructions, and then again, the debrief. And then, I go through the night. At the end, we have an individual reflection, and those are the prompts for that. So this is just kind of a mini, what I would call facilitator guided mini, but I would suggest that, I mean, even though I've taught this class, 15 to 20 times now, I still use it. And it's important because it helps keep me on track, and I've revised it every single time I revise it. Interestingly enough, there are some times when that 1 hour activity for a certain class will take an hour and a half, and for another class, they'll get through it in 25 minutes. Same with some of the lecture stuff, because of the particular personality of the class. So it is important to, before modifying it, every time you deliver it, is to recognize that there are going to be some differences in classes. And some of that's just the personality of the class. Sometimes you get a really chatty, interactive class that just loves to, bring in their own work experience and stuff. And that's really great. Other times you get, just dead air. Like they don't want to talk, they don't want to participate, they just want you to do all the learning for them. And in those cases, you either end up with a much shorter session, or you may, and again, it takes experience and whatnot to be able to bring in something else and say, okay, these guys aren't getting it, I've got to bring in something else. Sometimes I will have a back pocket activity, especially when I was less confident and experienced in front of a room. I would bring in 2 or 3 other pocket activities that I don't expect to have time to do, but just in case they burn through content or it just doesn't work, then you can go to having a backup, and I'll have it grayed out, but it's there. And so if I need it, and I'll have the slides prepped and they're just grayed out as well. And that way, if I have to go to a pocket activity, or if I have just an interesting class that's just not getting a concept, I'll take them on that side route, knowing that I've got the time and that I still have my structure. So, so I wanted to show you that. But now, I want to take you to kind of what I would do if I was doing an activity for facilitators who are not me. So if I'm preparing a facilitator guide, for somebody else. So this will help show you a lot more of the type of detail that I would bring to bear here. So a couple of things to notice off the top, right? The section. So there's this, main body of the document that really kind of goes into deep detail about how this activity, this particular thing is going to get done. And I will include the learning objectives in this case, because they want to know why they're there. So especially if it's a very complicated thing, we want to keep them on. It doesn't matter if the activity goes exactly how it was planned, or as, we don't want you to stick to the rules of how to do it. What we want to do is meet the learning objective. So if it goes in a different direction, but it swings back around and everybody's getting what you're trying to teach, that's a win from my perspective. So don't be so rigid in the game or the activity that you lose sight of what you're actually doing. So we will keep the learning objective front and center. This one happens to be a icebreaker, so the learning objective is pretty simple, but sometimes it can get quite complicated. And then how many participants? Is this easy, hard, medium? If it's on the harder side, we want to focus the facilitators on how to execute this properly. And I will do a training, before the activity, of course. Then what materials are there? Oftentimes we highlight this for the admin staff to make sure they have enough of the materials that they need. And then here's the setup and directions. So this tells you how to actually do it, how much time each component should take. And then, of course, always critical is this debrief. What was, share something you learned about yourself during this. What are the skills? You know, we had talked about these skills in the plenary, so we wanted the facilitator to pull out these skills. Again, this does assume a relatively experienced facilitator who knows how to do this. If we had, sometimes we're using a client's facilitators as kind of sub-facilitators for us, and if especially to run breakout rooms, if that's happening, we're going to give them more instruction because we know they're not skilled. If I know it's my skilled facilitators, obviously I expect them to do certain things. How long the activity takes and then what time is happening. That's important because they want to be able to set up how long the activity is, but they also want to know what time do we think we need to be on? Because if we get to the end, if something else ran behind and it's we need to get to the next thing by 11:05, then they may have to cut this to 18 minutes. And so we give them both timeframes just so that they understand that. So here's, you know, just an example of that. Oh, I will point out that at the very beginning of this particular facilitator guide, we had the session learning objectives listed for each day in the day. So that again, the facilitators, as they reviewed the previous day and then looked ahead into the next day, they could see what were the learning objectives for the whole session. So, so that's just another example of the types of facilitator guide, but let me just, you know, go back over one more time. What are the components of a good facilitator guide? You know, time is the hardest thing to manage. And so having those two elements of time, how much time each activity is going to take, and then where we should be in the day, very, very important. It's obviously the last thing you can design because you've got to get everything else placed where you need it before you then go back and put these times in place. And if you get to the end of your session, session design, and you realize you've over-designed, which is always the case for me, I always crammed way too much into a session, then I have to go back and figure out what activities I can shave. And if I can't shave them, then I got to take them out. So time, really, really important. The second thing is the activity, and within the components of that activity, there's a description of the activity and the learning objective. There's the main talking points. So if you are giving a lecture in this component, you want to just make sure that the main things you want to highlight, that you have lined it out in there, or any concept that needs specification where particular language is important. It might be good to have that particular language, and you can even you can read it just to make sure that that information is what goes out, and then you can paraphrase from there. The activity outline, really important. Like, you know, you may have a complicated game or whatever, and it may make sense to you. And this is where I always find out that stuff that makes sense to me doesn't always make sense to a facilitator. So that's where I get pushback, and they say, well, wait, what happens when you hand out these papers and then, you know, somebody takes it and does this with it. Ah, gosh, I didn't even think about that. So having multiple people review your activity is really important. And then also they may say, oh, well, wait a minute. You told them that they have to write things on sticky notes, but you forgot the sticky notes in your materials. So really important. So that's the other thing is once you have the activity outline, it's your list of materials, really important because you want to make sure you always come with everything you need. Now, a little pro tip, I always have a bag that I bring with me to class that has dry erase markers, and it has tape, it has scissors, it has glue, it has sticky notes of all different colors. It has pens because students don't bring pens anymore. So if you want to do a group activity with pens, got to have them. So I have like all the basics with me all the time. But then if you're going to have a case study printed out on little pieces of paper and cut out, you want to make sure that you don't forget the case study because they can't do much if you break them into groups and they don't have the case study. You can put a certain amount of stuff online, but the problem with putting things online is they're going to cut and paste it and put it into chat, and then you have a less effective learning session. So oftentimes you do have to print something out on a piece of paper so that you keep them focused on the activity, and it's a lot harder for them to cut corners. And then finally, putting in your debrief questions and making sure that those debrief questions are associated back with the learning objectives and how are you going to steer them towards the learning that you hope to get. Because, you know, I've certainly had that student review where, you know, I don't know, we didn't learn anything in this class. All we did was play with puzzles. Well, you know, obviously I didn't do a good enough job in that session of tying back why we played with puzzles to what the learning objective was. So important thing to do. And then any reminders, anything else that you need to think about. Remember, students often struggle in this area, and this is where your own personal notes for having delivered the session can be really helpful for you delivering it in the future. So this is a great place to capture that information. So that is the art of the facilitator guide. Thanks for listening and good luck with your sessions.